everyone, and welcome to the Bearded Geeks, the weekly grab bag of topics covering movies, comics, video games, and TV. My name is Jages, I am the Beard Master, and today we're talking about Hellboy, most notably Hellboy 2019, the newest adaptation in the Hellboy franchise from director Neil Marshall. Now, if you don't know who Neil Marshall is, maybe you know some of his previous films, some of which I'm a fan of, some of which, yeah, they're okay, but not so much. His first feature film was actually Dog Soldiers, which I am actually quite a big fan of. It's my second favourite film of his. After that, we had The Descent, which is his best film. We had Doomsday after that, which is like throwback. It's kind of like all your favorite 80s genres kind of rolled into one. It's kind of, you know, it's a bit John Carpenter and it's a bit George Miller and, you know, it's got all those kind of influences in there. It's Mad Max and it's kind of a little bit 28 Days Later zombie movie and it's kind of Escape from New York as well. But also he directed Centurion with Michael Fassbender in it. I've seen it once. I remember not hating it. I liked it, I think. But what you might know Neil Marshall from more recently is he's directed two of the most critically kind of acclaimed episodes of Game of Thrones. Well, two of the more critically acclaimed in the direction focus. And those two episodes were Blackwater, which is the Battle of Blackwater episode, and one of my personal favourite Game of Thrones episodes of all time, Watchers on the Wall. The Battle of Castle Black, which is fantastic episode. Love it very much. He's also directed a few episodes of Black Sails, Constantine, Hannibal he directed an episode of. And most recently, his kind of more recent TV efforts were the new Netflix Lost in Space series. I think he directed like the first two episodes of that, the pilot or the 2-hour premiere or whatever. So that's Neil Marshall. He's on board to direct this film. The film stars David Harbour, who you may have seen over the years but know nothing about. He's a character actor. He's been around for decades, but now he's only really getting his time of day, most notably because of his breakout role as Sheriff Hopper in Stranger Things, who we all love. We love that show. We love that character. He's fantastic in that show. And in this movie, he plays Anangun Raman, Hellboy. But before we touch on this movie too much, let's just wind the clock back just a little bit and we'll start at the beginning with Hellboy's cinematic outings. Now, I personally, anyone who listens to this show, who's listened to me talk before about kind of favourite directors and directors who really make an impact on me, I have three favourite directors of all time. The first one being John Carpenter, the second being David Fincher, and the third being Guillermo del Toro. He's a fantastic visionary, he's an amazing visual director, and he's a guy with a love for monsters and a real, like, understanding and love for cinema. And he directed the first two Hellboy outings, Hellboy and Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, to pretty good success, pretty moderate success. As I recall, they were critically liked, not beloved, you know, they weren't instant classics or anything, but they were liked and favoured upon by critics. Box office wise is a bit of a different story because Hellboy's kind of a little bit of an enigma. He's a little bit of an unknown kind of comic book character. He's originally from Dark Horse Comics, created by Mike Mignola. And he kind of he's more of one of those underground characters. People kind of know him, but he's not like on your levels of, you know, your Supermans or your Batmans or even to your extent now, Aquaman. But he's always been there, and the people that do love him, the fans of Hellboy, love him to death. He's a fantastic character. He's someone that I am a big fan of. I'm not completely versed in the Hellboy mythos, but I know my way around it, and I really enjoy the character and the look of the book and the darker storytelling, which kind of delves into, you know, monsters and kind of fairy tales and folklore and all those sorts of things, and interprets and intertwines them kind of into these books and into these stories. So that kind of stuff I've always loved. So I particularly liked the first two Hellboy movies. I remember watching the first Hellboy and I really liked it. Ron Perlman was fantastic. He was, like, at the time, the only guy that could really play that character. If you said, you know, who would they cast if you made a Hellboy movie? It was Ron Perlman. I mean, the guy looked like him, you know, straight off the page. And a lot of people give it a bit of flack, but I actually really like Hellboy 2, The Golden Army. I think in a lot of ways it's much better than Hellboy. It has more of Guillermo's directorial and kind of visionary and visual touch to it. And box office wise, the movie's kind of did okay. The budget on the first Hellboy was $66 million. It made $99 million worldwide, which is not a terrible success, but it did make some money. But if you look at it now, you know, once it goes into marketing and stuff, it probably didn't make any money. Honestly, it probably underperformed. It lost money. And Hellboy 2, The Golden Army had an $85 million budget, and that turnaround made $160 million. So that made a little bit more money, but they did spend more on it. And so Guillermo del Toro and Ron Perlman tried to get Hellboy 3 made for years. They tried and they tried and they championed and they couldn't get it done. And then eventually, this new Hellboy film was announced. It's going to be a reboot, not a continuation of those first two. There's going to be a new director, new cast, new writers, the works. And so the film's here now. I saw it yesterday. What's it like, Jages? What did you think? Well, I'm going to bloody tell you. Let me start at the beginning. Let me start with the trailers, because I was waiting for this movie. I really liked the casting of David Harbour. I thought it was fantastic casting. They released that first official still of Hellboy. You know, he's kind of the shirtless one, you know, kind of the portrait with a black background. He's looking very intimidating. Fantastic image. David Harbour really imbues kind of that physical presence, because I mean, you look at Hellboy in the book, he's got this massive bloody barrel chest and his 6 axe handles across the back, and he's got his little goat legs and stuff, which obviously they don't do in the movies. He's got regular legs, but it works. And he looked great. He looked the part, and I really liked the image, and I was like, man, I can't wait for a trailer. This is going to be great. The movie was going to come out pretty soon after it was kind of announced. They were aiming for like a 2018 release, but then it was pushed back. I think it was like 12 months. It was pushed back a whole 12 months. And it's finally out. I saw the trailers, and I didn't like them. The first trailer did nothing for me. There were a couple of jokes in there, which I didn't even think were funny. I thought they were pretty flat, actually. And I was like, you know what? It's probably just a bad trailer, you know? It happens all the time. Studios don't know how to market movies. You know, they pass it off to the marketing team and they're going to make something of it and put it out into the world. You know, sometimes they get the tone in that wrong, and sometimes a bad trailer's just cut. Okay, we'll give it a pass. We'll wait till the next trailer. Second trailer comes out. It's better, but it's still the same. It's not wowing me, not at all. And I'm just like, I'm starting to get real worried here. How you can't go 2 for 2 trailers. I know they're trying to focus on more of a horror element. They're saying it's going to be an R rating. Maybe there's going to be more gore and stuff. You know, they can't really show it in these trailers. You know, they're trying to appeal to more mass market. Okay, fair enough. Let's see how it goes. We'll wait till the movie comes out. The movie's got my money. Let's just wait till it comes out. So I saw it yesterday. I sat down. I paid my money. I watched it. And you know what? It's not very good. It's not a very good movie. We're going totally spoiler free on Hellboy today, so you can listen to this. Feel free to listen to the whole thing. I'm not going to spoil any of it for you. It's not particularly good. I didn't hate it. I didn't hate watching it. I kind of equate it to a movie I saw last year, which was Venom, which is a movie I hated. I gave it 1 out of 5. I thought it was a bad movie, but at the time while I was watching it, I didn't hate watching it, and I don't know why. And I felt the same with this, with Hellboy, although I believe this is a better film than Venom. I still think that was probably one of the worst films I've seen in the last few years. This is a bad movie, but I didn't hate it. Like, I have such a love in that for this character, and, you know, I'm a fan of darker imagery, and like I said earlier, like bringing in like folk stories and like folk tales, and you know, all those kind of things, like real world things, you know, and incorporating them kind of into this mythology. You know, I like that imagery and stuff. So maybe that's why I gravitated to this a little bit more than I did Venom, say, for example. But really, when you break it down, Hellboy 2019 is not a very good movie. It is an ugly movie. It's got that dark and grungy look. I think they were just going for something so completely different, whereas Guillermo's is very visually appealing, even though it's still quite a dark movie in that it doesn't really have that dirty, grungy, horrible, we're down in the dark filth of this horrific world, It doesn't have that. It still has like a beautifulness and kind of a real world like gloss and that to it. But the look in this movie, it's dark and it's grungy and it's ugly and it's totally bloody soaked in blood. I mean, it is so gory, this movie. We'll get back to that in a minute. They really utilize the R rating, the American R rating, to massive effect in this movie. So the look of the movie, it's very different. They're going for a very much darker tone. So, okay, I can appreciate that. We want to differentiate ourselves from those two films that have come previous, and we kind of want to line it up a little bit more with the books. Okay, that's fine. I'm on board. David Harbour as Hellboy. I thought it was good in a lot of ways, and in others, not so much. I really liked his look. Like I said, he's fantastic. He's got the big barrel chest. He looks fantastic. He's got 6 axe handles across the back. He's wide. He's a wide dude. And he's big. His Hellboy looks like a dock worker. He's just been down lifting crates, all day. And he's ripped. He's ripped to shit. And it looks fucking great. His Hellboy looks great. It definitely looks like the meth version of Hellboy compared to Ron Perlman's. I don't know if you saw it. There was that meme circulating last year. It was, the before and after drugs. Before you take drugs, and it was Ron Perlman's Hellboy. And then after you take drugs, and it's David Harbour's, and you're like, wow, looking at them side by side is so different. But you know what? I thought David Harbour was a really great choice. I thought the casting was great. I think it really comes down to the material he had to work with. And I've said that a few times lately, like, oh, it's not their fault, they didn't have a lot to work with. Well, in this case, that's very true, because the material here that they're working with is kind of all over the place. I mean, there is really no real cohesive narrative. Yes, as a positive, it is more in line with the books, the comics. That's a great aspect. It is more in line with the comics, which I really appreciate. But the movie, essentially, it kind of feels like a TV show where they've just strung all the episodes together, because it feels like they've picked like 3 or 4 different Hellboy stories. The official, what they've put out there is that this movie, the Hellboy stories that this movie is based around, are Darkness Calls, The Wild Hunt, The Storm and the Fury, and Hellboy in Mexico. Now, there are 4 different Hellboy stories there, and it kind of like picks and chooses and takes what it wants. It kind of feels like Aquaman in that way, where they're like, we're just going to take all the stuff we really like and we're going to jam it into 1 2-hour movie and just throw it all against the wall and see what happens. Because Aquaman felt like that as well, whereas that felt a little bit more cohesive. But it actually did feel like, here's all the Aquaman stuff ever, and we're just going to put it all in this movie and throw it up against the wall in case we never get to make another Aquaman movie ever again. It kind of feels like that, but in Aquaman's regard, it kind of worked, even though it was kind of bloated, and that was an enjoyable film, even though it wasn't as strong, as it probably could have been. This actually feels like it's not strung together as well. It does feel like different stories are pieced together. It really does feel like a TV show, and they've taken all the episodes and just chucked the episodes. Here's 10 episodes, and we've just chucked them into one complete 2-hour movie. And, like, individually, like, if you watch those segments, they probably work on their own. But strung together as, like, an entire narrative, it really just, it doesn't work. It is a faithful adaptation, yes, but it is very unfocused. The structure is not tight and sound. The movie feels very undercooked and that as well. Going back to David Harbour, what I didn't like about him, I liked David Harbour when he was being like a very quiet, when he was being like the reserved Hellboy, the very gruff, Hellboy. The physicality as well, all the action scenes and stuff, but what I didn't like, I didn't really feel like he sold the jokes very well. And I felt like any time David Harbour raised his voice, any dialogue he said just came out terribly. It didn't land well. There's a scene in the trailer where Nimew's talking to him and he's like, well, that's not going to work because I'm a Capricorn and you're crazy as shit or crazy as fuck or whatever the line is he says. And it just doesn't land. Same with the scene in the trailer where he gets out of the back of the truck and someone shoots at him and he's like, I'm on your side. I don't buy it. And I don't know if that's down to David Harbour or it's just the jokes. The jokes aren't funny. And he doesn't sell them as well. Maybe it's a bit of both, I don't know. But it does feel a very unfocused feature. Like I said, there are smaller segments, there are smaller scenes which work. And they're great, especially scenes with Alice, who's essentially our female protagonist of the film. She's incredibly interesting. And I liked all her scenes, particularly the scene where she's in the kitchen with Hellboy. And they're having a conversation back and forward. That's a great scene, I really liked that. And I liked her presence all throughout the film. But getting to secondary characters, let's talk about secondary characters and kind of undercooked story. Ian McShane plays Professor Brutenholm, or Professor Brute, the role that John Hurt played in the first 2 Hellboy films. Now, Ian McShane's a great actor. You just have to watch anything he does. Look at Deadwood, especially where he plays Al Swearingen. It's probably the best role of his career, the best performance he's ever put out there. And we've seen, like, Ian McShane come in and do this, kind of like play the mentor role. You know, he's a little bit sly, he's a little bit smart, he's a little bit cocky, you know, but he gets the point across and he means well. Like, we've seen him do that before. And he does it in this, and he's fine. He's great in this movie. But the thing that didn't really sell it for me is his relationship with Hellboy. He's essentially Hellboy's father, his adoptive father. And I didn't really get that father-son dynamic because Hellboy's journey through the film, he kind of feels like, you know, he's trying to find his place in the world. You know, he's essentially a monster. Everyone else around him is human, you know, and he's always sent to kill monsters, essentially sent to kill his own kind, you know, his brothers and sisters, as he puts it in the film. And he's kind of feeling a bit conflicted about that, you know, he's essentially just like a hitman. And he doesn't know, you know, they're like me, should I be killing them? Is there, you know, do we always have to kill them? Isn't there like a peaceful way we can do it? And his dad's there, Ian McShane. He's like, look, mate, we just got to bloody do it. They're all bad eggs. We got to get rid of them. And so that's kind of his confliction. And, like, I don't want to compare. We did this the other week with Pet Sematary, and I don't want to compare. But, I mean, look at the relationship between John Hurt and Ron Perlman in the first Hellboy film, especially. It's very warm. It's very loving. You can see that, you know, he loves his father. He worships and admires him. And as a son to John Hurt, to Professor Broom, and that you can see that he loves Hellboy, he loves Big Red, and he thinks he's everything to him. He is a son. He may not be his flesh and blood, but he is his son. And the relationship is very warm. Yeah, they do have a bit of strenuous relationship through that film, as you do. That just comes down to, you know, storytelling and plot and that. But in this, like, I didn't totally believe it. Like, yeah, he's his dad, but that kind of feels just like at odds all the time. Although there is one scene, the final scene they share, which is right at the end of the film before the movie wraps up. I thought that was kind of the best scene for them because Ian McShane really got to kind of lay it out how much he actually does care about Hellboy and how much, you know, he thinks of him. And he does think the world of him. You know, you're my son and all this stuff. And that scene was fantastic. I thought that was great. That was like the best possible, like, the best father and son dynamic they'd had in the entire film. And it was the one I liked the most, and I thought it was great. I just wish it was a little bit more of that, you know, between the film. Yeah, he does have that love and admiration for his son through the entire film, but he's kind of more, he kind of plays it more as a little bit emotionally distant, I guess. They have a more emotionally distant relationship. Yes, he calls him son and my boy and that through the whole movie, and you're my son, and he calls him dad, and, you know, he rings him on the phone and it says dad and all that stuff. But I just didn't, like, believe it. I just, like, you could have just had a couple more just to build it up a little bit more. You know, I understand that was probably perhaps for plot and that, to kind of keep Hellboy at a distance because he kind of is at odds with, you know, the monsters he's sent to kill and the humans that he lives with and kind of works under and that as well, and his own father. So perhaps that was the reason why there was kind of that emotional distance created between the two of them. But they did have that big emotional payoff at the end, so maybe that's why. Talking about the big bad in this movie, Milla Jovovich plays Nimue, the Blood Queen. The opening scene of the movie kind of sets up the backstory of the Blood Queen. Nice bit of exposition and voiceover by Ian McShane, which is actually quite great. Well, some of the best voiceover I've heard recently. It's just Ian McShane just gets an excuse to swear. Whenever he swears, it's really good. It's great, actually. I thought Milla Jovovich was good in this movie. I thought she was great. She played it quite well. It was a little bit campy, but I think Milla Jovovich gets a bit of a hard rap lately because, you know, the last 10, 15, 20 years or whatever, she's, you know, been doing all these Resident Evil films and Ultraviolets and all these other movies and that, you know, they're not of quality, let's say. They're okay, you know, they have an audience, but they're not, you know, critically acclaimed darlings or whatever. So I think there's kind of this little bit of an unfair stigma with Milla Jovovich that when someone sees her in a movie, they think, oh, it's going to be trite because that's all Milla Jovovich ever has done in the last 20 years, which is kind of warranted, but also at the same time unfair because you're already judging something before you actually see it, which isn't fair at all. I think this is probably some of the best work she's done in probably the last 10 years. Not that that's saying much because some of her previous work hasn't been the best. But yeah, she doesn't just play it as straight up evil sorceress who wants to destroy and rule the world or whatever. You know, there's a little bit of pathos in that in there, you know. She wants what's best for her kind, essentially, for all monsters or whatever. And yes, she does kind of want to punish the human race. But you know what? I thought she was one of the better performances in the film. Put her in there number 2 after David Harbour. I thought she was great. There's a few other characters in there. We get a flashback scene with Thomas Hayden Church where he plays Lobster Johnson, very famous character from the comics. The flashback scene is actually particularly good. I really liked it. I thought he was great for the limited screen time he had. It was just great seeing like another character, like another costume character from that universe show up in the film because it just really added kind of to the very comic booky silliness kind of the books, really. You've got a guy called Lobster Johnson. I mean, it's great. The scene he was in was pretty good. I really enjoyed it. Although he didn't really have too much to do because essentially it was just a flashback. We also had Daniel Day Kim as Ben Daimyo. Now, there was some controversy when the movie was first casting because Ed Skrein was originally cast as Ben Daimyo, but then there was obviously a bit of internet backlash because in the comic, correct me if I'm wrong, but Ben Daimyo is an Asian American, and obviously Ed Skrein isn't. And so Ed Skrein put out this fantastic tweet about how he decided to step down, and it was a tweet about diversity and stuff and that. It was very sweet and very touching, and, you know, that was a real stand-up act from Ed Skrein to drop out. So, you know, it essentially forced the filmmakers in the studios, like, well, now we've done that and the attention's on us, we have to cast, you know, an appropriate actor to fill the role. And that's where they cast Daniel Day Kim a month later. Now, Daniel Day Kim plays Ben Daimyo, who is a member of the British version of the BPRD, or is he a different agency? I'm not sure. I kind of can't remember that. But, you know, he's okay. He's there in the movie. His English accent is it's fantastic. Like, it's bloody impeccable. Like, this guy's got the chops. His accent work in this is fantastic. He does pretty good with what he has, but really he's kind of just a side note, and he doesn't really have too much to do in the movie. He does have one quality of his own, and he has a flashback scene of his own, kind of just laying out his backstory and that as well. But essentially, he doesn't really have too much to do. He's kind of like a third fiddle to the Hellboy, Alice, and, you know, Ben Daimyo. They're kind of the trio, kind of the kick-ass trio of the movie. And he's fine, although he doesn't really have much to do. It just feels like more of an afterthought, really. But one of the things I'm really going to harp on just a little bit here is, when I was watching the movie, I was watching it and I'm like, the CG in this is pretty bad. It's not the worst I've ever seen. It looks better in some scenes than others, but you can tell by watching it, there's a limitation with the budget. And when I was watching it, I'm like, you know what? This is probably like $100 million budget. That's why, you know, the CG isn't as good. You know, it was pretty much, there was CG kind of all throughout the film. But I was just like, you know what, they didn't have the money to spend on top of the line stuff and, you know, put more time and effort and that into it. But you know what we got? It's It's fine, but it's not the best I've ever seen for like an almost summer release US film. But then I did a little bit of research yesterday afternoon after I watched the film, and I couldn't actually find an official number. The closest number I found to a budget was $50 million, which is less than both of the previous Hellboy movies. It kind of shows the movie does look cheap, and the CG does look cheap in that as well. But on the flip side of that same coin, talking about, I thought it was a $100 million budget, and I'm like, oh, you can see kind of the constraints of the budget. The amount of CG that's in this film, for a $50 million budget, I mean, they wringed every cent they could out of that budget, because there is essentially CG throughout this entire film. There are CG characters all throughout the entire film. Yes, they don't look the best, but for what they could achieve with $50 million, if the budget was $50 million, is a pretty bloody good effort, and they should be applauded for that. Yes, people are going to give a crap because it does look cheap, but for $50 million, I mean, bloody hell, they wringed every single penny they could out of it and put into that CG, which you got to give them credit for. If they had another $25 million, $50 million, maybe it would have looked, if they put that much effort into it, maybe they wouldn't have. When you have more money, you tend to be lazier. But because they had a lesser budget, they had to make it look as good as they possibly could. In a lot of scenes, it does, yes. In others, not so much. But I can't really fault them too much if their budget was so low. I mean, try to find a movie, like an almost or summer release or kind of a blockbuster movie, comic book movie, that had a $50 million budget and looks this good. I doubt you'll find one. Now we've talked about the characters, we've talked about the cast, we've talked about the plot, and we've talked about the CG. Jags, what about the R rating? You mentioned this earlier. Yes, this movie does have an R rating, an American R rating, which means, there's going to be profanity, there's going to be swearing, there's going to be violence, there's going to be some blood. Fine. David Harbour had mentioned earlier that this Hellboy is it's going to feel a little bit more like a horror movie. There's going to be a bit of gore and stuff. I think there was a Red Band trailer earlier last year or later last year that came out. It was actually pretty good. We got to see a bit of blood, we got to see some gore in that. It looked pretty good. You're like, okay, I'm excited for where this direction's going. The American R rating is different to the Australian ratings. In Australia, we have a different rating system. We have, obviously, at the bottom, starting with G, we have a PG rating, we have an M15+, we have MA15+, for mature audiences, and we have R18+, for restricted. Now, an American R rating for us is generally an MA15+. That's our second highest rating. I was quite surprised the other day when I looked up the film times and saw that Hellboy here in Australia was rated R18+. I can't remember the last R-rated movie I went to see. I think it was Kill Bill Volume 1, and that was nearly 20 years ago. So I was like, man, if we've got an R rating over here, then it must have some gore and blood in it. If you're really into gore and blood and all that sort of stuff, if you want to come to see this movie for that, you are going to love this movie because there is so much gore. There is so much blood. There's heads getting cut off. There's arms getting cut off. There's walking into rooms with corpses and split open and guts spilled out everywhere. There's people getting shot in the face. There is so much violence in this movie. And someone was asking me today, it was like, I don't like when violence in movie is gratuitous. I like it if it serves the plot and it serves what's happening, but I don't like if it's too over the top. Is it too over the top? Well, I have two favorite scenes in the film. My favorite scene is actually the very end scene of the film. And there is another scene where Hellboy fights a couple of giants. And that is a pretty cool scene. Yes, it is violent. There is some swords getting swished into people and stuff getting cut off and blows landed in heads and stuff like that. But, a lot of those scenes, when it comes to the action, I don't feel that the violence is too gratuitous or over the top. But going back to David Harbour talking about how this film is almost more like a horror movie, there are more horror aspects of this film. If anybody follows Hellboy or is, versed in any kind of Russian kind of folklore or anything like that, there's a character called Baba Yaga who is present in the books and she's also present in this. And if anybody knows their kind of Russian folklore, Baba Yaga likes to eat children. Now, like I said, when it comes to the violence, when it comes to the action, I don't feel it's too over the top. Yeah, it's a bit, it might be pushing it a little bit, but I don't feel it's too over the top. But there are some scenes in it which are more horror-based and are aimed to be more horrific. And I really feel that it pushes the R rating in those scenes, because there's a scene, this is probably the most spoiler I'm going to get, there's a table laid out in front of her, and there's a pot, and somebody lifts the lid off the pot, and there's like children's fingers in the pot. So it looks like a stew, and there's children's fingers in there. And then somebody turns and looks into her kitchen, and there are corpses of children hanging up in her kitchen, dismembered and cut up, and there's blood and that everywhere. It's really pushing that horrific agenda, or that horrific horror, that horrific gore, that horrific look. And you see it in the trailers and that as well. And there's a shot in the movie, you've seen it in the trailer, there's like a gigantic demon walking through the Thames, and it kind of has its arms outstretched, and it knocks down London Bridge. And there's a few other like shots in the trailers of like gigantic demons walking through the streets of London. In those scenes, which are essentially, demons rising from hell, almost kind of a hell on earth kind of thing, those scenes of Londoners being grabbed, civilians being grabbed from the streets and eaten or dismembered or burned alive or anything like that, that edges toward the more horrific side. Because, if demons were walking the earth, demons from hell were walking the earth, it wouldn't be a picnic, it would be very horrifying. So, those two scenes in particular, yes, it does push that R rating absolutely to the limit, I feel. I think some people might be a little bit unsettled by the amount of violence that's in this movie. Personally, for me, and this is just my personal opinion, I didn't find it too gratuitous, but I'm normally used to a lot of that stuff. I watch a lot of horror movies and stuff. I'm a little bit desensitized, so it kind of doesn't bother me as much. But I think the average film goer who'd probably go to watch it wouldn't enjoy it as much, or somebody who's a bit squeamish, for example, it might be a bit too much for them, because there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of limbs, there's a lot of viscera flying around, so they may just have a little bit of a hard time with it. Finally here, as I wrap it up, I will say about Hellboy, some of the cast does a good job, especially David Harbour. Mila Jovovich was great. The young lady who plays Alice, I had her name in the front of my mind, and now I've just lost it. She's great as well. They're probably the three standouts. Ian McShane's always good. It's just that the relationship between him and Hellboy probably wasn't exactly what I wanted, but maybe they were playing that toward the plot. But I don't know. It just didn't. It didn't sell it to me, is what I'm saying. The story feels very unfocused. It kind of feels like ramshackled, stapled together. If you broke this movie down into like 10 different parts and just watch like those 5 or 10 minute segments on their own, they'd be fine. But as a whole cohesive unit, I feel that it doesn't work. It pulls a lot from different Hellboy stories and kind of just chops and change and pieces it together, which is great if you're a comic book fan. I feel like the film is very much aimed toward those fans. There is a lot of fan service and that in here, but in some ways it feels like you need to be a fan of the series to get the most out of it. I feel like the average film goer would have a bit of a hard time with this movie than they would, if they weren't already a fan of the source material. It's an ugly movie. It's very dark. It's going for a dark, dour tone. It feels a bit plain. It feels a bit generic. I feel like there's probably a lack of vision in that as well. They're probably kicking themselves. Studio's probably kicking themselves. They're like, we should have just made that bloody third Guillermo del Toro movie. We should have just let him come in and do it now that he's an Oscar winner and everything, because I don't know how this film is going to go, to be honest. If it's got a $50 million budget, I reckon it'll make it back. It may make a little bit of a profit, but on a good day, I really feel like if this was to crack maybe 300 to 350 million, that would be absolutely swinging for the fences. That would be the absolute best case scenario for them. I don't feel like it's going to do that. I feel like it'll probably make maybe 150 million, maybe 200 million tops, 150 to 200 million tops maybe. That's probably pushing it. Maybe that's on the outside. But I don't know. It could turn around and end up being a runaway success. I mean, look at Venom. That movie was fucking terrible. But people really liked it. I don't know why. Like me. I hated that movie. But while I was watching it, I didn't not enjoy myself. It's weird. And I felt that way with this as well. I was sitting there, I was watching it, I'm like, this is a bad movie. But I'm not having a bad time watching it. What is wrong with me? What is wrong with these movies? I do feel Hellboy is a better movie than Venom, but not by too much. People might have different scales in that. I mean, a lot of people like the humor in that in Venom, which I didn't. I thought it was just too try-hard and ridiculous and over the top. Whereas the humor in this was just, there was barely any. And when there was trying to be humor, I just felt that it just didn't work. If you're a fan of Hellboy, you're probably going to go see this anyway. I like David Harbour. I liked his casting. I would like this to maybe do well enough for there to be a sequel, but if there is a sequel, these filmmakers have got to take every single thing on board and be like, right, we can't do that again because we didn't do a very good job. I think if there's going to be a sequel, I don't think Neil Marshall will come back. I think he'll probably do one and go. I don't feel like he's the director who would stay around for numerous sequels. He's the kind of guy who kind of wants to do one thing and then move on to something different and then on to another thing. And he's kind of a guy who likes to dabble in many different things. He doesn't want to be tied down to a particular genre or a particular character for too long. Would I recommend Hellboy? To fans, to anybody who's curious, maybe go and watch it. I think general film goers, may enjoy it. Anyone who doesn't like gore and stuff, don't go because you're not going to enjoy it because there's a lot of it in here. There's a lot of blood. There's a lot of gore. There's a lot of viscera, like I said. What would I give it out of 5? I would give it 2 out of 5 stars. Not the worst movie I've ever seen, but it's probably the worst movie I've seen so far this year. And I think that's it for Hellboy. Thanks for listening, everyone, while I unpack this one. I really wanted to like this movie. Now I'm kind of bummed that it wasn't better. But, I'm hopeful for the future. Very hopeful, actually. I hope it does get a sequel, and I want it to do better. I really do. I like David Harbour. Give him more of a chance to do something better with the material. Anyway, that's it from me. I've been Jages, your friendly neighborhood beard master, and I'll see you next week on the Bearded Geeks. Hey!